So for the next little while, then we'll be talking about egoism, these two forms of egoism we've already, to some extent, distinguished and we've encountered in talking about Hobbes. It's worth giving you a flavor of the agenda here. So I've got one of these agenda slides, look. So this is probably what we'll be doing for the next, I would guess, couple of classes, next 4 of these sessions. It's going to be a little longer. I don't really expect you to write these ones down. It's just, it's just a sense of where we're going. All right. So, start then with the question about how to understand the distinction between psychological and ethical egoism. You can learn a good deal of what you need here just by kind of focusing on comparing the two definitions, right? So if we go back to PowerPoint here for a minute, look. So, I mean, if you sort of compare the two definitions to each other, right? I mean, they don't differ in terms of sort of the universality here. They both start with everyone always, right? And they both have this same concept of acting selfishly, right? The difference, right, is between this and this, right? Between the claim that people in fact act selfishly and the claim that they ought to act selfishly. So then, the question is how to understand that difference. So look, I mean, the first thing to say is that, psychological egoism is a factual theory, ethical egoism is a normative or evaluative theory. The question then is sort of what more can you say to articulate or explain that difference? What I'll introduce you to is what is sort of the standard way in contemporary philosophy to say more about and articulate the difference here. Let me sort of sketch this for you, then I'll give you some stuff for your notes about it. So, the key sort of metaphor that gets used here is the metaphor of direction of fit. It's a matter of the way in which the theory is supposed to fit onto the world or the world onto the theory. It's a matter of the way in which theory or world is to be adjusted if there's a discrepancy. It's a bit abstract. Let me give you a flavor, and then, as I say, I'll give you something for your notes here. So look, the idea is, with respect to factual theories, like psychological egoism, what's going on is that the theory is supposed to fit the world, right? It's supposed to accurately describe things the way they are. So if there's a failure of fit between the theory and the world, that means the problem's with the theory, right? It's the theory that's wrong, it's the theory that has to be adjusted. By contrast, the thought is, in the case of normative or evaluative theories like ethical egoism, the direction of fit goes sort of the other way, right? So those sorts of theories are supposed to give kind of a standard to which the world is supposed to live up. And then if there's a failure of fit between the world and the theory, the thought is, at least from that theory's point of view, it's the world that's wrong. It's the world that's sort of failing to meet the standard. So that's a direction of fit that goes the other way. Right? All right. So I've got. I mean, that's to introduce the idea. I've now got. I think I've got probably, because it takes a bit of writing out. I've got a couple of slides here, setting this out in more detail. How close are you? Ready for slide 2 yet? A little more. Okay. I give you some. Let me do that too, thank you. How about now? Everybody ready for slide 2? All right? Ready? Okay, so let me say, I guess, 3 further things about this, right? I mean, one is this, look, I mean, that difference in terms of direction of fit, right? It's not just the difference between psychological and ethical egoism. It's also, right, the difference between any 2 otherwise parallel theories, such that one's a factual theory and the other's an evaluative theory. Right? So if you want to know the difference between the 2 silly theories that everyone is over 2 feet tall and everyone ought to be over 2 feet tall, right? That's just the same difference. It's a direction of fit difference, just the way we had here. Second, I mean, to see that right is to see that other ways of attempting to characterize the difference that people are sometimes tempted by are mistaken, right? The most common way of getting this wrong is this. People say, psychological egoism says people always act selfishly. Ethical egoism says people only sometimes act selfishly. So they make it sound as if ethical egoism is an alternate factual theory that's weaker than psychological egoism. But look, that's not the way it is, right? I mean, once you understand how this works, ethical egoism isn't a factual theory at all. It doesn't say anything about how people in fact act. It's exclusively a normative theory. It's a theory about how people ought to act. And it's not that it's weaker than psychological egoism. It's rather that it's a theory of a different kind, a theory that is sort of in a different domain. Third, what that perhaps helps to bring out is that psychological and ethical egoism are not competing theories, right? It's not that they're sort of competitors in the same arena, right? Rather, psychological egoism competes with other factual theories about human nature, right? Ethical egoism competes with other evaluative theories. Right? And they're competing in different arenas in just the way that, professional, basketball teams compete in a different league and, with different alternate teams than professional baseball teams do, right? I mean, it's not that, So, that being so, it wouldn't really make much sense in a paper to sort of say, well, psychological egoism is not true, so ethical egoism must be, or something. Because if you write something like that, it's as if you're thinking they're competitors, if you don't choose this one, you've got to choose that one. That's not the way it is, right? I mean, psychological egoism and ethical egoism don't compete with each other. They each compete with a range of distinct alternate theories in their domain, in their league, right? Whereas, and they're different sorts of theories. They play in different leagues. Yeah? That makes sense? Okay. Cool. So, next thing then we're going to do, as that little agenda slide a bit ago suggested, is we're going to focus in on psychological egoism. Okay. What you want to do, I think, before you get into the arguments in favor of psychological egoism, is sort of see the default right. Yeah. So look, psychological egoism is a very strong universal thesis, right? I mean, it's not just the thesis that people are quite selfish, there's a bunch of selfishness about, etc. It's rather the very strong universal thesis that absolutely everyone is always selfish. Yeah? And when you see that, right, you see that it's a thesis that we ordinarily take to be false. Right? I mean, we ordinarily think there are a bunch of unselfish actions. We've got lots of apparent examples. Right? dramatic ones, you know, soldiers throwing themselves on grenades to save comrades, right? You know, undramatic, everyday ones, people doing stuff for their kids or their friends and whatnot, right? That being so, right, the psychological egoist has a significant kind of burden of proof to overcome. What the psychological egoist got to be able to do is to give you some powerful argument that shows that this ordinary impression that there are unselfish actions is mistaken, right? If they fail to do that, then your verdict on psychological egoism should be it's false. Yeah? All right, so the job one has to do then is to look and to see whether there are arguments for psychological egoism with sufficient power to overcome this sort of standing burden of proof, well, this sort of presumption against it to overcome the burden of proof it faces. Right? And Rachel's does, he does quite a nice job of articulating the most familiar such arguments. The only thing he does is, we'll come to this in a while, is he, in recent editions, sort of runs together what I think are really two somewhat different arguments as one, but that's for a bit further along. The first argument he does, right, this is it's on pages 65 and 66 under the heading, the argument that we always do what we most want to do. To understand what he says in setting out that argument, you've got to know about the example he uses, the example of Raoul Wallenberg. So let me just read you a little bit of what he says about that from page 64. Right, so this is from the middle of page 64. Raoul Wallenberg, a Swedish businessman who could have stayed safely at home, spent the closing months of World War II in Budapest, Hungary. Wallenberg had volunteered to go there as part of Sweden's diplomatic mission after hearing reports of Hitler's final solution to the Jewish problem. Once there, he helped persuade the Hungarian government to stop deporting Jews to the death camps. When the Hungarian government was replaced by a Nazi puppet regime and the deportations resumed, Wallenberg issued Swedish protective passes to thousands of Jews, insisting that they all had connections with Sweden and were under the protection of his government. He helped many people find places to hide. When they were discovered, Wallenberg would stand between them and the Nazis, telling the Germans that they would have to shoot him first. At the end of the war, when there was chaos and other diplomats were fleeing, Wallenberg stayed behind. He is credited with saving as many as 15,000 lives. Wallenberg disappeared after the war, and for a long time no one knew what had happened. Now it is believed that he was killed not by the Germans, but by the Soviets, who imprisoned him after taking over Hungary. So, you know, this is a particularly dramatic example of someone who engaged in a sustained way in apparently unselfish action. Right? But, you know, I read it to you immediately at this point just because he refers to it in setting out this first argument. So as Rachel's articulates the first argument, this is bottom of 65, he says this. Again, under the heading, the argument that we always do what we most want to do. If we describe one person's action as altruistic and another person's action as self-interested, we are overlooking the fact that in both cases, the person is merely doing what he or she most wants to do. If Raoul Wallenberg chose to go to Hungary and no one was coercing him, then he wanted to go there more than he wanted to remain in Sweden. And why should he be praised for altruism when he was only doing what he wanted to do? His action was dictated by his own desires, by his own sense of what he wanted. Thus he was moved by his own self-interest. And since exactly the same may be said about any alleged act of kindness, we can conclude that psychological egoism must be true. All right. So that's the argument, this first argument. As I take it, the natural way to understand it is as a two-premise argument like this. I've got a slide with it on. I've got she's in, you could put he or she or whatever, put the S in brackets if you want. So the question then is what to make of this argument. Let's remind ourselves. So when we have an argument formulated, that is when we have an explicit statement of the premises and conclusion, what questions do we have to ask about it to decide whether it's any good? Is it valid and sound? That is, given the definition of soundness, is it valid? Are the premises true? Yeah. Okay. So first thing to ask about this argument then, is it valid? Yes. It's valid. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if it's true that everyone always does what they most want to do, and it's true that if you do what you most want to do, you're acting selfishly, right? Then surely it's true that everyone always acts selfishly, isn't it? Isn't that right? So, as you'll see, ultimately I agree with Rachel's in thinking that this is a bad argument. But I think there's a bunch that he says in criticism of it that's mistaken, right? The first such mistaken thing he says, well, not the first in order, but the first one I want to draw your attention to, is actually the last little paragraph of his discussion of this. So it's the second to last paragraph on 66, immediately before he turns to the second argument, right? He says, therefore this argument goes wrong in just about every way that an argument can go wrong. The premise is not true. We don't always do what we most want to do. And even if it were true, the conclusion would not follow from it. So the latter part of that means this argument is invalid, and the former part of it suggests that Rachel's is treating it as a one-premise argument. Seems to me that's stupid. I don't know why he does that. I mean, it seems to me very clear that the argument he has in mind is properly pictured as the two-premise argument that I just gave you. And understood as that two-premise argument, it's a valid argument, right? I mean, it's true that you could make it an invalid argument by omitting the second premise. But, you know, I mean, the second premise, I think, is clearly there. And indeed, as we'll see in a while, Rachel's actually gives you what are clearly criticisms of the second premise. So why he treats it as a one-premise argument that's invalid instead of a two-premise argument that's valid is sort of beyond me, but he does, right? I mean, that's the first thing he says in criticism that I think is mistaken. He then offers, you know, this is the usual pattern, right? I mean, if you're giving criticisms of two-premise arguments, well, of course, he doesn't recognize it's a two-premise argument, but he then offers two further criticisms, and those are naturally understood, despite what he says in that unfortunate paragraph at the end there, as criticisms of the two premises, right? First, what he offers is, in effect, a criticism of premise one, a criticism to the effect that we don't always do what we most want to do. Here he gives the example of a person who keeps a promise, though he doesn't want to. Right? So this is first full paragraph on 66. He writes, "This argument, however, is flawed. There are things that we do not because we want to, because we feel that we ought to. For example, I may write my grandmother a letter because I promised my mother I would, even though I don't want to do it. It is sometimes suggested that we do such things because we most want to keep our promises. But that is not true. It is simply false to say that what I most want is to keep my promise to my mother. My strongest desire is to break my promise, but I keep it anyway as a matter of conscience." So, with that example, right, Rachel's is denying the first premise. He's saying, no, there are cases like this sort of case where a person keeps a promise where they don't want to, where it's not true to say that people are doing what they most want to do. Sort of claim that people always do what they most want to do is false. Yeah. This criticism, too, I think, is problematic. Right? I think that there is something sensible that the proponent of this argument can say in response to the criticism. To make that response, what you've got to do is you've got to, in effect, distinguish different possible interpretations of terms like want and desire. Right? So you can distinguish what we can call a narrow everyday sense of these terms from a broad technical sense. So in a narrow everyday sense, wants are only one kind of motivational state. So there are certain things that move us to action that we do call wants or desires, like desires for, you know, ice creams and, you know, to play ball and to get a new TV and things like that, right? But there are other sorts of motivational states, like the kind that Rachel's draws attention to here, that we wouldn't call wants, right? When we act out of what we would call a feeling of obligation, or because we feel that we ought to, because we promised, and so forth. It's not terribly natural in ordinary language to characterize those as wants or desires. So, in this narrow everyday sense, wants or desires are sort of one kind of motivational state, but there are other kinds as well. So it's true if you use the term want or desire in that way, then people don't always do what they most want to do. But look, the person defending this argument can say, that's not the only way that these terms can be understood. Right? There is this contrasting broad technical sense of terms like want and desire. So in that sense, sort of any motivational state, any state that moves you to action, counts as a want, whether it's, you know, the feeling of obligation to keep a promise, or, you know, something connected to the, you know, appetizingness of an ice cream. Equally, in this broad technical sense, these are wants. Further, the person, you know, responding in this way to Rachel's criticism can say, I'm not kind of just making this up in order to defend this argument, right? This broad technical sense of terms like want and desire is familiar in social scientific contexts. I mean, economists, you know, quite often use the terms in just this kind of broad way. So, you know, in defending this argument, what you say, Rachel, your criticism of premise one fails, because when I say people always do what they most want to do, I'm not using want, as you seem to suppose, in this narrow everyday sense. Instead, I'm using it in this broad technical sense. And when you understand that, you'll see that these examples you give me that are supposed to be counterexamples aren't really. Everyone with me on that one? Again, this is one of this pattern of argument things, right? So, you know, we have the initial argument, and then we've got Rachel's objection, right? And then what I just gave you was a reply to the objection. So it's sort of three steps, three moves there, right? Okay, so, I mean, if you count his remarks about validity as a criticism, right, as I take it, at this point, Rachel's is sort of 0 for 2 in his criticisms of this argument. I don't think, you know, either the claim that it's invalid or the criticism of the first premise work out. Right? But I still think he's ultimately right in rejecting the argument. And the reason I think he's ultimately right is that the criticism he offers of the second premise, which of course, given his unfortunate way of conceiving the argument, he doesn't see as a criticism of the second premise, but nonetheless, the criticism he offers of the second premise is compelling, right? What, by thinking about this, you come to see is that the second premise sort of incorporates an indefensible conception of what selfishness is. Here's Rachel's articulating the criticism. This is the middle paragraph on 66. The argument has a second flaw. Suppose we concede that we always act on our strongest desires. Even if this were granted, it would not follow that Wallenberg acted out of self-interest. For Wallenberg wanted to help others, even at great risk to himself. For if Wallenberg wanted to help others, even at great risk to himself, then that is precisely what makes his behavior contrary to psychological egoism. The mere fact that you act on your own desires does not mean that you're looking out for yourself. It all depends on what you desire. If you care only about your own welfare and give no thought to others, then you're acting out of self-interest. But if you want other people to be happy and you act on that desire, then you are not. To put the point another way, in assessing whether an action is self-interested, the issue is not whether the action is based on a desire, the issue is what kind of desire it's based on. If what you want is to help someone else, then your motive is altruistic, not self-interested. See, there I think Rachel's is exactly right. Let me sort of reinforce the point with a different example or pair of examples than he uses, right? So consider stylized versions of Mother Teresa and Donald Trump. For these purposes, it's not going to matter whether the depictions I give of these two individuals are accurate, right? I mean, just consider them as I depict them, right? So, let's suppose Donald Trump's dominant desires are always for more wealth and power and personal satisfaction for himself. Right? Those are the desires he acts on. They sort of explain his behavior and the pattern of his life. By contrast, Mother Teresa, let us suppose, is primarily motivated by desires to help others even at great personal cost. Those explain the pattern of her life in, spending her life helping poor people in Calcutta and so forth. Right? Look, according to the conception of selfishness built into premise 2 of this argument, Mother Teresa and Donald Trump, as I just described them, are equally selfish. But that's crazy, right? I mean, any conception of selfishness that doesn't draw the line somewhere between Mother Teresa and Donald Trump, as I just characterize them, just as a non-starter at capturing that concept, right? So when you see that the proposal sort of in effect built into this argument, the proposal that says you should understand selfishness simply as a matter of acting on your own desires, whatever they happen to be, whatever their content. I mean, that's, on reflection, when you stop and think about it a bit, that's just a hopeless conception of what selfishness amounts to. All right. So are you convinced that we should reject this first argument, or does anyone think that I've been in some way unfair to it? Anyone want to? Try to resuscitate it? Yeah.
So should we only use this second reply to the argument, or should we use the first one as well?
If you're writing about it, well, I mean, it's better to do, I guess in my view, right, I mean, it'd be better to do the first reply than no reply. It'd be better to do the second one than the first one. I mean, if you do the first one, you might want to notice the issues with it, the fact that it seems amenable to a response. Right? Yeah. Yes.
I know you mentioned burden of proof earlier.
Yeah.
What strikes me as odd is how psychological egoism can make the claim that everybody is acting selfishly, and the simple thing is I find it kind of like an analogy to, are there aliens somewhere out there? You can't really make a statement like that out of favor because you haven't really, there's no way to check every human being that has ever acted or done anything to make sure whether or not they really just wanted to. It's like the thing that proves the theory right would be impossible to find, and there's a weakness in the theory in that.
Well, yes. So look, given that it's the kind of universal thesis it is, then I mean, I agree. It seems hopeless to try to defend it by something that's conceived of as sort of just looking at zillions and zillions and zillions of examples where up front you don't know whether the example will help you or not, right? But I think in a way that's the sort of burden of proof point. That is, look, so that means if you're going to defend psychological egoism, you can't hope to do it that way. So what you've got to have is you've got to have some sort of compelling general theoretical reason, right, that guarantees that all actions are selfish. It can't be that you're going to do it by the kind of, case-by-case induction that you're talking about. And see, I mean that is part of the appeal of the argument I just gave you. I think the argument should be rejected. But look, I mean, if that argument went through, you wouldn't have to go looking at every individual case anymore, right? I mean, as long as you were, if you were convinced by the theoretical defense of the first premise and you were convinced, as I said, you shouldn't be, but if you had been convinced that the second premise was the right way of capturing selfishness, bingo, it's done. You don't need to then look at all the cases, right? And anything else about this argument? There are a couple of things one might be tempted to say here if one were in the business of trying to defend psychological egoism. One that will naturally lead us to where we're going next is this. Someone might say, but look, think about that example of Mother Teresa. The thing about Mother Teresa is she helps other people, but that brings her satisfaction. So that's really why she's doing it. Right? Suppose someone were to say that. The right thing to say in response, and this parallels things that we've seen Rachel saying at earlier points, the right thing to say in response would be, well, look, to say that is not to defend the argument we've just been looking at, because the argument we've just been looking at is supposed to support psychological egoism merely on the basis of the fact that people do what they want to do. Right? So to say the thing about Mother Teresa seeking satisfaction doesn't defend the first argument. But it does suggest a new and different argument that's worth exploring, an argument that defends psychological egoism not just on the basis that people do what they most want to do, but rather on the basis that what people are really after is satisfaction. And that's independent, interesting argument that's had a bit of a run in this literature and is worth thinking about. So why don't we'll take a bit of a break and then we'll turn to that.